The sun burned mercilessly over the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1882, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Thomas Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse along the dusty trail leading back to his ranch. The aging cowboy had spent the morning checking on his cattle near the Apache reservation boundary, a task that always left him uneasy given the recent tensions in the area. Mackenzie had been running his small ranch for nearly 15 years, ever since he arrived in Arizona as a young man seeking his fortune. Unlike many of his neighbors, he had always maintained peaceful relations with the local Apache tribes. His ranch hands often joked that he was one of the few white men the Apache trusted, though Mackenzie knew that trust had been hard-earned through years of fair dealing and respect for their customs. As he crested a small hill, Mackenzie noticed something unusual in the distance. A large group of men on horseback had gathered near the old trading post that sat at the crossroads between the town of Copper Creek and the Apache lands. The sight made his stomach tighten with worry. Large gatherings of armed men in this part of the territory rarely meant anything good, especially when they were positioned so close to Apache territory. Spurring his horse forward, Mackenzie approached the group cautiously. As he drew closer, he could make out the faces of men he recognized from town. There was Sheriff Morton, a corrupt lawman who had been causing trouble since his appointment 6 months ago. Standing beside him was Wade Harrison, a wealthy businessman who had been trying to buy up land in the area for his mining operations. Several other men Mackenzie recognized as Harrison's hired guns completed the group. What truly shocked Mackenzie was what he saw in the center of the gathering. 7 young Apache girls, none older than 16, sat bound on the ground. Their faces showed a mixture of fear and defiance that broke his heart. Above them, a hastily constructed gallows cast an ominous shadow. The sight made Mackenzie's blood run cold. He had heard rumors in town about missing Apache girls, but the tribal leaders had been too proud to ask for help from the white authorities. Now he understood why. These girls hadn't simply disappeared, they had been taken, and whoever was responsible was preparing to silence them permanently. Mackenzie dismounted his horse and approached the group, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He had learned long ago that in situations like this, showing fear was the worst thing a man could do. Sheriff Morton looked up as he approached, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, if it isn't the Apache lover himself," Morton sneered. "Come to watch some justice being served, Mackenzie?" "What's the meaning of this, Morton?" Mackenzie asked, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "Those are just children." "These ain't children," Wade Harrison interjected, stepping forward. "These are thieves and murderers. We caught them red-handed stealing from supply wagons headed to my mining operation." Mackenzie studied the girls more carefully. Their clothes were traditional Apache dress, and their hands showed no signs of recent manual labor that would suggest they had been handling stolen goods. More importantly, he recognized 2 of the girls as daughters of Chief Running Bear, a man he had traded with many times. These girls came from respected families within the tribe. "That's a lie, Harrison, and you know it," Mackenzie said firmly. "I know some of these girls. They're from good families." "Your word against ours," Sheriff Morton replied, his hand moving to his gun. "And last I checked, I was the law around here." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mackenzie realized he was outnumbered 10-1, but he couldn't stand by and watch innocent girls be murdered. He had seen enough injustice in his lifetime to know that sometimes a man had to take a stand, regardless of the odds. As he looked around at the faces of the men surrounding him, Mackenzie began to piece together what was really happening. This wasn't about theft or justice. This was about something much bigger and more sinister. Harrison's mining operation had been struggling to acquire the land he needed, and the Apache had been refusing to sell. What better way to force their hand than to create an incident that would justify military intervention? The girls sat silently, their dark eyes watching every movement around them. Mackenzie could see the intelligence behind their gaze, and he suspected they understood more English than they let on. One of the older girls, whom he recognized as Running Bear's daughter, caught his eye for just a moment. In that brief glance, he saw a plea for help that cut straight to his soul. Mackenzie knew he had to act quickly. The sun was beginning to set, and he could see the men were growing impatient. Whatever Harrison and Morton had planned, they wanted to finish it before darkness fell. The rancher's mind raced as he tried to figure out how one man could possibly save 7 lives against such overwhelming odds. "Before you do anything hasty," Mackenzie said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. Maybe we should talk about this properly. These girls disappear and you'll have the entire Apache Nation looking for answers. Harrison laughed, a cold sound that echoed across the desert. Let them look. By the time anyone figures out what happened, it'll be too late. The Apache will blame the military will blame the Apache, and I'll have all the excuse I need to bring in federal troops to clear this land once and for all. The admission confirmed Mackenzie's worst suspicions. This was indeed a carefully planned plot designed to start a war that would benefit Harrison's business interests. The lives of 7 innocent girls were just the price he was willing to pay for his greed. Mackenzie's mind worked furiously as he assessed his situation. The men around him were armed and dangerous, but they were also overconfident. They believed they had already won, which might give him the small advantage he needed. He noticed that most of Harrison's hired guns had their attention focused on the girls rather than on him, treating him as nothing more than an unwanted witness, you know. Harrison, Mackenzie said conversationally, killing these girls won't give you what you want. The Apache aren't fools. They'll know this was a setup, will they? Harrison replied smugly. By the time their bodies are found, they'll be wearing stolen goods from my supply wagons. The evidence will speak for itself. Sheriff Morton nodded eagerly. And I'll be the one to conduct the investigation. Amazing how these things work out. Mackenzie felt sick at the level of corruption he was witnessing, but he forced himself to remain calm. He needed these men to keep talking, to reveal more of their plan. The more he understood about their scheme, the better chance he had of stopping it. What about me? Mackenzie asked. You can't just let me right away after hearing all this. Oh, you're not going anywhere, Morton said with a cruel grin. Tragic story, really. Local rancher tries to help some Apache thieves escape justice. Gets shot in the confusion. These things happen in the territory. The casual way Morton discussed murdering him told Mackenzie everything he needed to know about how far these men were willing to go. They had already crossed the line from theft and corruption into cold-blooded murder. 7 girls and 1 rancher would just be the beginning if their plan succeeded. Mackenzie glanced at the sun, which was now touching the horizon. In the growing twilight, he could make out movement in the rocks about a quarter-mile away. At first he thought it might be Apache warriors coming to rescue the girls, but as he looked more carefully, he realized it was something else entirely. The movements were too deliberate, too organized to be a rescue party. Looks like you've got company coming, Mackenzie said, nodding toward the distant rocks. Harrison and Morton both turned to look, squinting in the fading light. What they saw made their faces go pale. A line of soldiers was moving along the ridge, their uniforms clearly visible even at a distance. But these weren't the federal troops Harrison had been hoping to manipulate. These were territorial soldiers, and they were moving with the precision of men who knew exactly what they were doing. What the hell? Morton muttered, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. Mackenzie allowed himself a small smile. Earlier that morning, when he had been checking his cattle, he had encountered a patrol of territorial soldiers. Their commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, was an honest man who had been investigating reports of missing Apache girls. Mackenzie had mentioned seeing unusual activity near the trading post, and the captain had promised to investigate. Captain Rodriguez is a thorough man, Mackenzie said calmly. He doesn't like loose ends. Harrison's face twisted with rage. You sent for them, didn't you? Didn't have to, Mackenzie replied. Turns out the territorial government has been watching your mining operation for weeks. Amazing what a little corruption investigation can turn up. The truth was that Mackenzie had indeed spoken to Captain Rodriguez, but he hadn't been certain the captain would take action so quickly. The arrival of the soldiers was both a relief and a complication. While their presence might save the girls, it also meant that Harrison and Morton would become increasingly desperate. We need to finish this now, Morton hissed to Harrison, before those soldiers get close enough to interfere. Agreed, Harrison replied, drawing his gun. String up the girls. We'll claim they were trying to escape when the soldiers arrived. Mackenzie knew he was out of time. The soldiers were still too far away to help, and Harrison's men were already moving toward the gallows. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the first girl would be placed in a noose. It was now or never. Without warning, Mackenzie dove to his left, rolling behind a large rock as bullets whistled over his head. The sudden movement caught Harrison's men off guard, but they recovered quickly and began firing in his direction. Mackenzie drew his own gun and returned fire, forcing them to take cover. Take him alive if you can, Harrison shouted, We might need him as a hostage. Mackenzie knew his position behind the rock wouldn't protect him for long. Harrison had too many men and they would soon surround him. But he had accomplished his immediate goal. The attention was now focused on him rather than on the girls. He could only hope that would buy enough time for help to arrive. One of the girls, Running Bear's daughter, caught his eye from where she sat bound near the gallows. With remarkable courage, she had managed to work one hand partially free from her bonds. She was trying to signal something to him, but in the chaos of gunfire, he couldn't understand what she was attempting to communicate. Then he saw it. While the men were focused on their gun battle with him, none of them had noticed that the girl had managed to reach a knife that had fallen from one of their belts. She was cutting through the ropes that bound the other girls, working as quickly as she could while staying hidden behind the gallows structure. Mackenzie realized he needed to keep the gunfight going long enough for all 7 girls to free themselves. Once they were loose, they could scatter into the desert rocks where Harrison's men would have difficulty following them. The approaching soldiers would find the girls safe and Harrison's men in the act of attempted murder. "You can't hide behind that rock forever, Mackenzie," Morton called out. "Come out and we'll make it quick." "I've got a better idea," Mackenzie shouted back. "Why don't you explain to Captain Rodriguez why you're about to hang 7 innocent girls?" The mention of the captain's name seemed to rattle some of Harrison's hired guns. These men were used to operating in the shadows, not facing military justice for their crimes. Mackenzie could see uncertainty creeping into their faces as they realized their situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with bullets flying in both directions across the desert clearing. Mackenzie counted his ammunition carefully, knowing he had perhaps a dozen shots left. He needed to make each one count while keeping Harrison's men pinned down long enough for the girls to complete their escape. Behind the gallows, Running Bear's daughter had successfully freed 5 of the 7 girls. They crouched low, hidden by the wooden structure, waiting for the right moment to make their break for the rocky terrain. The 2 remaining girls were having trouble with their bonds, which appeared to be tied more tightly than the others. Mackenzie noticed that one of Harrison's men, a thin gunslinger named Pete Carson, was trying to work his way around to the left to get a better angle on his position. Mackenzie shifted his aim and put a bullet close enough to Carson's head to make him dive for cover, effectively stopping his flanking maneuver. "Damn it, Pete, stay where you are," Harrison shouted angrily. "We've got him trapped." But Mackenzie could see that Harrison was growing increasingly nervous. The wealthy businessman kept glancing toward the approaching soldiers, who were now close enough that their individual faces could be made out in the fading daylight. Captain Rodriguez was leading the column, his stern expression visible even at a distance. "Maybe we should reconsider this whole thing," one of Harrison's men called out nervously. "Those soldiers are getting awfully close." "Shut up and keep shooting," Morton replied. "We're in too deep to back out now." Mackenzie realized that Morton was right about one thing. They were all in too deep to back out. Harrison and the corrupt sheriff had committed themselves to a course of action that would result in multiple murders if they succeeded. They couldn't afford to let anyone live who could testify against them. Suddenly, Mackenzie heard a new sound that filled him with dread. The thundering of hooves coming from the opposite direction of the soldiers. He risked a quick look and saw another group of riders approaching fast. These weren't soldiers. They were more of Harrison's men returning from some other errand. "That's Jim Baxter and his boys," Harrison called out triumphantly. "Now we've got you surrounded proper, Mackenzie." The situation had just become much more desperate. With Baxter's reinforcements, Harrison would have nearly 20 men against Mackenzie's single gun. Even worse, the new arrivals might spot the girls trying to escape and recapture them before they could reach safety. Mackenzie made a quick decision. He couldn't win a prolonged gun battle against so many opponents, but he might be able to create enough chaos to give the girls their chance. He pulled out his last stick of dynamite, a tool he always carried for clearing rockfalls on his ranch, and lit the fuse with a match. "Fire in the hole," he shouted, hurling the dynamite toward the center of Harrison's position. The explosion sent dirt and rocks flying in all directions, creating a massive cloud of dust and debris. In the confusion that followed, Mackenzie heard the sound he had been hoping for, the rapid footsteps of the Apache girls running toward the rocky terrain where they could find safety. But the explosion had also given away his exact position. As the dust settled, Mackenzie found himself facing the barrels of half a dozen guns. Harrison's men had managed to surround his position while he was distracted by throwing the dynamite. "Drop your weapon, Mackenzie," Sheriff Morton commanded, stepping out from behind a boulder with his gun drawn. "It's over." Mackenzie looked around at the circle of armed men closing in on him. Behind them, he could see that 6 of the 7 girls had successfully escaped into the rocks. Only one remained, the youngest of the group, who appeared to have twisted her ankle during the chaos and couldn't keep up with the others. "Let the girl go," Mackenzie said, slowly lowering his gun. "Your fight is with me, not with children." "Our fight is with anyone who gets in our way," Harrison replied coldly, "including Apache brats who know too much." Captain Rodriguez and his soldiers were now less than 200 yards away, but Mackenzie knew they wouldn't arrive in time to save either him or the remaining girl. Harrison's men would finish their murderous work and claim they had been defending themselves against an Apache attack. "You know, Harrison," Mackenzie said conversationally, playing for time, "you've made one big mistake in all this." "And what's that?" Harrison asked with a sneer. "You assumed the Apache don't have friends in the territorial government." Harrison's expression changed slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Captain Rodriguez isn't here by accident," Mackenzie explained. "He's been investigating you for weeks. Those supply wagons you claim were robbed, they never existed. The territorial government has been tracking every shipment to your mining operation, and they know you've been filing false claims for stolen goods." The color drained from Harrison's face as the implications of Mackenzie's words sank in. If the territorial government had been investigating his operations, then his entire scheme was already compromised. Killing the girls and Mackenzie wouldn't solve his problems. It would only add murder charges to the fraud charges he was already facing. "You're lying," Morton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Mackenzie asked. "Then why don't you ask Captain Rodriguez when he gets here? I'm sure he'll be happy to explain why he brought a territorial prosecutor with him." Mackenzie was gambling now, hoping that his partial knowledge of the investigation would be enough to shake Harrison's confidence. He had no idea whether a prosecutor was actually traveling with the soldiers, but he needed Harrison to believe that his situation was hopeless. The psychological pressure seemed to be working. Several of Harrison's hired guns were looking nervously at each other, clearly wondering if they had signed up for more trouble than they had bargained for. These men were criminals, but they weren't stupid. They could see that their employer's grand scheme was falling apart. "Even if that's true," Harrison said finally, "it doesn't change anything. We still need to clean up this mess." But Mackenzie could see the doubt in Harrison's eyes. The wealthy businessman was beginning to realize that his carefully laid plans had been built on a foundation of lies and corruption that was now crumbling beneath him. The tension in the desert clearing reached a breaking point as Captain Rodriguez and his soldiers drew close enough to clearly see what was happening. Mackenzie could make out the captain's shocked expression as he took in the scene. The gallows, the remaining Apache girl, and the circle of armed men surrounding a lone rancher. "This is Captain Rodriguez of the Territorial Army," came the commanding voice across the desert. "Lower your weapons immediately." Harrison's men hesitated, unsure whether to obey the military command or follow their employer's increasingly desperate orders. The moment of uncertainty gave Mackenzie the opening he needed. He dove toward the young Apache girl, shielding her body with his own as gunfire erupted around them. "Protect the civilians," Captain Rodriguez shouted to his men as they spurred their horses forward. The soldiers charged into the clearing with military precision, their disciplined approach a stark contrast to the panicked chaos of Harrison's hired guns. Several of the gunmen threw down their weapons immediately, recognizing that resistance against trained soldiers was futile. But Harrison and Sheriff Morton weren't ready to surrender. They had too much to lose and nowhere to run. Morton fired wildly at the approaching soldiers while Harrison grabbed the young Apache girl, pulling her away from Mackenzie's protective embrace. "Stay back or the girl dies," Harrison screamed, pressing his gun to the child's head. Captain Rodriguez raised his hand, signaling his men to halt their advance. The experienced officer had dealt with hostage situations before, and knew that any sudden movement could result in an innocent death. "Let's talk about this, Harrison," the captain said calmly. "You're a businessman. You understand negotiations." "There's nothing to negotiate," Harrison replied, his voice cracking with desperation. "You people have destroyed everything I worked for." Mackenzie slowly got to his feet, his hands visible and empty. He could see the fear in the young girl's eyes, but also the same courage he had witnessed in her older companions. Even in this terrifying situation, she was watching and listening, waiting for an opportunity. "Your mining operation was built on fraud from the beginning," Captain Rodriguez continued. "We have documentation proving you filed false claims about stolen shipments. This girl and her companions had nothing to do with any theft because there was no theft." "Lies," Morton interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. The corrupt sheriff was beginning to realize that his association with Harrison had led him into a trap from which there might be no escape. "We also have witnesses who saw you and your men kidnapping these girls from the reservation," the captain added. "This was never about theft or justice. This was about starting a war to justify seizing Apache land." Harrison's face twisted with rage and desperation. "So what if it was? This territory needs development, not savage reservations. These Apache are standing in the way of progress." "That's not your decision to make," Mackenzie said firmly, "and it's certainly not worth murdering children." The standoff continued for several agonizing minutes. Harrison's grip on the girl remained tight, but Mackenzie could see sweat beading on the businessman's forehead despite the cool desert evening. The man was clearly struggling with the reality that his grand scheme had collapsed around him. Suddenly, the girl made her move. With remarkable quickness, she bit down hard on Harrison's hand that held the gun. Harrison screamed in pain and loosened his grip just enough for the girl to twist away from him. Mackenzie lunged forward, tackling Harrison to the ground as the gun went flying. Captain Rodriguez's soldiers immediately moved in to secure the area. Within moments, Harrison, Morton, and the remaining hired guns were in custody. The corrupt sheriff made one last desperate attempt to escape, but found himself facing the business end of 3 military rifles. "It's over," Captain Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying across the desert. "All of you are under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and attempted murder." Mackenzie helped the young Apache girl to her feet, checking to make sure she wasn't injured. She looked up at him with grateful eyes and spoke a few words in her native language that he didn't understand, but her meaning was clear. "The other girls?" Mackenzie asked the captain. "My men are already searching the rocks," Rodriguez replied. "We'll find them and make sure they get safely back to their families." As if summoned by his words, the 6 escaped girls emerged from their hiding places among the rocks. They had been watching the confrontation, ready to help their young companion if necessary. The reunion of the 7 girls was emotional, with tears of relief and words of comfort exchanged in their native tongue. Mackenzie watched the scene with satisfaction, but also with a heavy heart. The conspiracy he had uncovered was more extensive than he had initially realized. Harrison's plan to start a war between the Apache and the territorial government could have resulted in hundreds of deaths on both sides. "How did you know to bring so many soldiers?" Mackenzie asked Captain Rodriguez. "We've been watching Harrison for months," the captain explained. "His fraudulent insurance claims raised red flags with the Territorial Treasury Office. When you mentioned unusual activity near the trading post this morning, I decided to investigate with sufficient force to handle whatever we might find." "And the prosecutor Mackenzie mentioned?" one of the soldiers asked. Captain Rodriguez smiled. "Actually traveling with us, believe it or not. Mr. Harrison's legal troubles are just beginning." As the soldiers prepared to transport their prisoners back to town, Mackenzie took a moment to speak with Running Bear's daughter, the brave girl who had freed her companions during the gun battle. "You saved them all," he told her in the few Apache words he knew. She replied in English, surprising him with her fluency. "You saved us all, Rancher Mackenzie. The Apache people will not forget this kindness." The formal way she spoke reminded Mackenzie that these weren't just children caught up in adult conflicts. They were young people with their own intelligence, courage, and dignity. Harrison's greatest crime hadn't been fraud or corruption. It had been treating human beings as obstacles to be eliminated rather than people deserving of respect. The journey back to town took place under a star-filled desert sky, with Captain Rodriguez's soldiers providing escort for both the prisoners and the rescued Apache girls. Mackenzie rode alongside the military column, his mind still processing the evening's dramatic events. The corruption he had uncovered ran deeper than anyone had imagined. During the ride, Captain Rodriguez shared more details about the investigation that had been quietly underway for months. Harrison's mining operation had been hemorrhaging money from the start, built on exaggerated claims about mineral deposits that didn't actually exist in profitable quantities. To cover his losses and attract new investors, Harrison had been filing fraudulent insurance claims for supposedly stolen supplies and equipment. The Territorial Treasury Office started noticing patterns, the captain explained to Mackenzie. Supply wagons that were reported stolen but never actually shipped. Mining equipment that was supposedly destroyed by Apache raids but was actually sold to other mining operations in California. So the missing girls were never really about theft, Mackenzie observed. Harrison needed a dramatic incident to justify federal intervention, Rodriguez confirmed. He planned to use their deaths to claim the Apache were becoming increasingly violent, threatening the safety of all settlers in the region. That would have given him the excuse to request federal troops to clear the entire area. Mackenzie shook his head in disgust. All those lives he was willing to sacrifice for money. The 7 Apache girls rode together near the front of the column, their spirits notably improved now that they were safely away from their captors. Despite their ordeal, they showed remarkable resilience, talking quietly among themselves and occasionally sharing what appeared to be jokes based on their subdued laughter. Running Bear's daughter, whose name Mackenzie learned was White Dove, rode her horse with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire life in the saddle. When she noticed Mackenzie watching them, she guided her horse closer to his. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said in her careful English, "my father will want to thank you properly when we return to the reservation." "That's not necessary," Mackenzie replied. "I just did what anyone should do." "No," White Dove said firmly. "Not anyone would risk their life for Apache children. Most white men in this territory would have ridden away." Her words carried a weight that made Mackenzie uncomfortable. He didn't consider himself a hero. He had simply been unable to stand by while innocent people were murdered. But he was beginning to understand that his actions had significance beyond just saving 7 lives. Sheriff Morton, riding with his hands bound behind his back, had been growing increasingly agitated during the journey. As they approached the outskirts of Copper Creek, he finally broke his sullen silence. "You people don't understand what you've done," Morton called out desperately. "Harrison was bringing development to this territory. Jobs, prosperity, civilization. Now you've destroyed all of that for a bunch of savages." Captain Rodriguez turned in his saddle to face the disgraced lawman. "Sheriff, or should I say former Sheriff Morton, your definition of civilization seems to include kidnapping children and planning mass murder. I think the territory will be better off without that kind of development. The Apache don't belong here anyway," Morton continued his rant. "This land should be used by people who can make it productive." White Dove's expression hardened at Morton's words, but she maintained her dignified silence. Mackenzie, however, felt his anger rising. "Those people have been making this land productive for generations," Mackenzie said sharply. "They know every water source, every seasonal pattern, every plant and animal in hundreds of square miles. Just because they don't strip mine it into barren waste doesn't mean they're not using it." Harrison, who had remained silent during most of the journey, finally spoke up. Easy words from a man who makes his living off a few hundred head of cattle. "I was planning to bring real industry to this region. Mining operations that could employ hundreds of men. Built on lies and fraud," Captain Rodriguez pointed out, "and maintained through murder. The Apache would have been relocated anyway," Harrison said defensively. "I was just accelerating an inevitable process." Mackenzie realized that Harrison still didn't understand the magnitude of his crimes. In the businessman's mind, he had been pursuing legitimate goals through questionable means. The lives of 7 young girls were simply acceptable casualties in his grand vision of territorial development. As they entered the town of Copper Creek, word of their arrival spread quickly. Citizens emerged from their homes and businesses to watch the unusual procession. Many were shocked to see their sheriff in custody, while others seemed relieved that the truth about recent events was finally coming to light. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the town's physician, and one of the few people who had dared to question Morton's version of recent events, emerged from her clinic to examine the Apache girls. Her medical training had made her suspicious of Morton's claims about Apache raids, since the supposed victims he brought in never had injuries consistent with his stories. "Are any of them hurt?" Dr. Mitchell asked Captain Rodriguez. "They seem to be in good condition physically," the captain replied, "but they've been through a terrible ordeal." Dr. Mitchell approached the girls with the gentle manner she used with all her patients, regardless of their background. She had learned some Apache words during her years in the territory, and used them to communicate her peaceful intentions. White Dove served as translator between Dr. Mitchell and the other girls, demonstrating the leadership qualities that had enabled her to organize their escape attempt. It was clear that despite her youth, she was regarded with respect by her companions. "They're all healthy," Dr. Mitchell reported after her examination. "Tired, frightened, but not seriously harmed. They're remarkably strong young women." As the soldiers prepared to secure their prisoners in the town jail, Mackenzie found himself thinking about the broader implications of what had happened. Harrison's scheme had been stopped, but the attitudes that made it possible were still prevalent throughout the territory. Too many people shared Morton's view that Apache rights were less important than white economic interests. 3 weeks after the dramatic rescue at the trading post, Thomas Mackenzie found himself riding toward the Apache reservation for a very different purpose than his usual cattle business. Chief Running Bear had sent word requesting his presence at a formal ceremony to honor his actions in saving the 7 girls. The territorial prosecutor had worked swiftly to bring charges against Harrison, Morton, and their accomplices. The evidence was overwhelming, not only from Mackenzie's testimony and the girls' accounts, but from the extensive paper trail of fraudulent insurance claims that investigators had uncovered. Harrison faced charges of fraud, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempting to incite warfare between the territorial government and the Apache Nation. Morton's case was even more damning. As a sworn law enforcement officer, his betrayal of public trust carried additional penalties. The territorial government had also discovered that he had been taking bribes from Harrison for months, allowing the businessman to operate his fraudulent schemes without interference. Most of Harrison's hired guns had accepted plea bargains in exchange for testimony against their former employers. Only Pete Carson and Jim Baxter chose to fight the charges, but their trials were scheduled for the following month, and legal experts predicted quick convictions given the mountain of evidence against them. As Mackenzie approached the Apache settlement, he was struck by the organized beauty of the community. Unlike the hastily constructed mining camps and rough frontier towns that dotted the territory, the Apache village showed evidence of generations of careful planning and environmental harmony. Adobe buildings were positioned to take advantage of natural shade and wind patterns, while carefully tended gardens made the most of the limited water resources. Chief Running Bear emerged from his home to greet Mackenzie personally, an honor that the rancher understood was rarely granted to outsiders. The chief was a man of impressive bearing, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Thomas Mackenzie," the chief said in accented but clear English, "you have given my people a great gift. Not just the lives of our daughters, but proof that there are still white men who value justice over profit." "I only did what was right," Mackenzie replied, feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the formal reception. "Many people know what is right," Running Bear observed. "Few are willing to risk their lives to do it when they are outnumbered and outgunned." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Mackenzie had ever experienced. The 7 rescued girls, dressed in their finest traditional clothing, performed a dance that told the story of their ordeal and rescue. White Dove, as the eldest and the one who had organized their escape, held a position of honor in the performance. After the dance, Chief Running Bear presented Mackenzie with a beautifully crafted knife, its handle decorated with intricate beadwork and silver inlay. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief explained. "It has been in our family for 4 generations. I want you to have it as a symbol of the bond between us." Mackenzie accepted the gift with deep humility, understanding that he was receiving something of immense cultural and personal value. "I will treasure this always," he promised. But the most meaningful part of the ceremony came when White Dove stepped forward to address him directly. In the weeks since her rescue, she had clearly been thinking deeply about the events they had all experienced. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, her English now more confident than before, "I want you to know that what you did has changed how my people see the possibility of friendship with white settlers. For too long we have seen only men like Harrison and Morton, who view us as obstacles to be removed." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You showed us that there are white men who see us as people deserving of respect and protection. This gives us hope that our 2 peoples might find a way to share this land in peace." Her words carried a weight that extended far beyond the immediate events. Mackenzie realized that his actions had become part of a larger story about the relationship between Apache and white communities in the territory. The rescue had demonstrated that, Cooperation and mutual respect were possible, alternatives to the cycle of mistrust and violence that had characterized so many interactions. Chief, Running Bear nodded approvingly at his daughter's words. White Dove speaks wisdom beyond her years. The path forward for our peoples will not be easy, but it must be built on the foundation of mutual respect that you have shown. As the formal ceremony concluded, Mackenzie was invited to share a meal with the chief's family. During the dinner, he learned more about Apache culture and history than he had absorbed in 15 years of living in the territory. The conversation was enlightening, revealing the depth of Apache knowledge about sustainable land use, water management, and wildlife conservation. Your people could learn much from Apache farming and grazing techniques, Chief Running Bear suggested. We have developed methods over many generations that allow the land to remain productive indefinitely. Mackenzie nodded thoughtfully. I've noticed that Apache lands always seem to have better grass and cleaner water sources than areas where white ranchers operate. Because we take only what we need and give back to the land, White Dove explained. Many white settlers seem to believe that land is something to be conquered rather than partnered with. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics from astronomy to animal behavior. Mackenzie was impressed by the sophisticated understanding of natural systems that Apache culture had developed through centuries of careful observation and experimentation. He prepared to leave the next morning. Chief Running Bear made an unexpected offer. Thomas Mackenzie, if you are willing, I would like to propose a formal alliance between your ranch and our community. We have much to teach each other about managing this difficult land. The proposal was revolutionary for its time. Formal cooperation between white ranchers and Apache communities was almost unheard of in the Arizona territory, but Mackenzie could see the wisdom in combining Apache knowledge of the land with the resources and connections that his ranch could provide. I would be honored to work with your people, Mackenzie replied. Together, we might build something better than either of our communities could achieve alone. As Mackenzie rode home across the desert he knew so well, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. What had begun as a routine cattle inspection had evolved into an adventure that not only saved 7 lives but opened the possibility for a new kind of relationship between two very different cultures. The treacherous plot that Harrison and Morton had conceived was indeed fully revealed. But its exposure had led to something far more valuable than simple justice. It had created an opportunity for understanding and cooperation that might serve as a model for the entire territory. In saving 7 Apache girls from hanging, Thomas Mackenzie had discovered that sometimes the most important victories are those that point toward a better future for everyone.